Hi, Lahav.
Hi, Daniel.
How are you doing?
Good.
How's Twitter?
You know what? When I'm really busy with work, I'm not on Twitter as much. So.
I think one of the benefits, we'll say, of this conversation is we have to be off of Twitter while we're doing it.
That is
unless
true.
You check your phone. But for your benefit, I brought a couple of tweets that I think may set the tone for the opening subject.
Are we starting by making me angry? Is that the...
It's not my goal.
All right, go ahead.
But we're in the middle of a war in Europe, and we might as well talk a little bit about it. So I have two tweets here. One of them is from Aaron David Miller. Mm-hmm. I looked at his feed today. Most of his tweets are getting, 10 retweets, likes. It's pretty low numbers, except this one, which has over 700 at the time that I printed this. So he wrote, "It looks very much like Israel/UAE, worried about alienating Russia, are hedging in their response to Putin's aggression in Ukraine. This is a key moment for Biden. Forget UAE for a minute. Israel is America's closest Middle East ally. Biden should expect Bennett to act like it." Second tweet I have here is by Daniel Seidemann, a well-known, we'll call him a Jerusalem expert.
Jerusalem hater? No. Israel. Anyway.
He recently guided...
I don't think Jerusalem expert is really sums up what he does. Yeah.
You understand. So Daniel Seidemann, by the way, recently gave a presentation to Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and her delegation from a Jerusalem overlook.
That's interesting because I was supposed to give a presentation last week to Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, and mine was canceled because her flight had been delayed 10 hours. So interesting that they went with him and not me.
Well, here's what he said. "Putin is hemorrhaging consequences. That does not necessarily portend a quick end to this, but the final result is not in doubt. If we in Israel encountered 10% of these consequences, we would be incentivized to end our occupation of the Palestinians, liberating both sides." So that's my Twitter feed. So I want to back up and ask you, it was just a few days ago when the war in Ukraine escalated, started, intensified with the Russian invasion. What have Israeli leaders been doing, saying? What is our position? Why is it complicated?
Okay. I have a lot to say about those tweets, but good. We should give people background where we are on the day that we're recording this. After Putin gave his whole long rant about why he thinks that Ukraine shouldn't exist, which just sidebar, it was interesting to me because Israelis are always there's no other country in the world where people doubt its right to exist. And I was actually, there's a couple. There's Ukraine, there's Taiwan, there's probably others out there. But in any case, Putin gave this whole speech and it was clear that he was going to invade at some level, but not clear at what level. And Israel put out a statement in support of Ukraine and saying that, we're willing to take part and help in any way to prevent bloodshed and give humanitarian aid if needed. Then, overnight, or it was about 4 a.m., I think, or 5 a.m. when the invasion actually started. And it immediately, or almost immediately, became clear that Putin was going to be attacking all over Ukraine and not just, the Donbass. So several hours after that, Foreign Minister Lapid actually said, "We condemn Russia's attack on Ukraine, and then it's undermining the international order." Those are the words he used, international order, and they were chosen carefully. And so everyone was like, okay, Israel's condemning Russia. But a few hours after that, Prime Minister Bennett spoke at a military ceremony, and, it's normal for the Prime Minister to use whatever ceremony he's speaking at that day to talk about the issues of the day. And he once again reverted to the previous statement where he expressed support for the people of Ukraine, but didn't say anything about Russia. Now, my understanding from speaking to some of the people closest to Bennett and Lapid, who work with them every day, said that these two statements were coordinated, that Lapid is going to be the one who's tougher on Russia, and that Bennett's going to maintain that, the word neutrality, because I think it's wrong for Russia to attack Ukraine, but he wants to sort of maintain a distance, so to speak, from taking a side publicly. Now, a day later, that was Friday, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, who I have to say is really, going beyond anybody's expectations. At this point, Ukraine, I think, has been fighting for 72 hours, doing much better than anyone thought they would, but also just this president who, had no political experience, was a comedian, and he's really just defending his country valiantly on the world stage. In any case, he called Bennett, and he repeated a request that had been made of Israel several times over the past year, which is for Israel to mediate between Russia and Ukraine. Former Prime Minister Netanyahu once asked Putin directly, and then at another time asked other senior level people in Putin's office, and Putin said no both times. Zelensky asked Herzog when Herzog was in Ukraine late last year, and then in October, before Bennett visited Putin at his dacha in Sochi, Zelensky asked Bennett to offer it to Putin, to offer to mediate. Bennett offered. Putin said no. And we've known that for a little while, but something that came to light, or at least that I read for the first time over the weekend, is that in that meeting in October, Putin called Zelensky a Nazi, which I would love to know how Bennett responded to that. I have not been able to attain that information, but it just sheds a little light on, even in private meetings that nobody's hearing, Putin has drank his own Kool-Aid and is calling Zelensky, the grandson of a Holocaust survivor and a Jew, a Nazi. Anyway, so that's more or less where we are diplomatically. Oh, and also this morning, we're talking on a Sunday, Israel announced that it's sending 100 tons of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, and that Israel is still willing to, take part in any kind of negotiations. Behind the scenes, again, from talking to senior sources, Israel is not really going to be mediating between Russia and Ukraine. Russia doesn't want it. Israel sort of wants to stay as far away from this conflict as possible. It doesn't really have anything to do with us. And so, we're saying it because it's the right thing to say, but not because anyone actually expects it to go anywhere.
What is it about Israel's position and relationship with both Ukraine and Russia that the idea would even come up that Israel, a country that can comfortably fit inside Lake Michigan, 9 million people, why would we be in a position to mediate between Ukraine and Russia? And what is it about our relationship with Russia that matters to us?
So first of all, I don't really think we are in that position, but Zelensky thinks we are, and his people think we are. It's because Israel has good relations with Russia and Ukraine, and in the Ukrainian view, it doesn't come down too much on either side, and therefore is really neutral. It's not just about Russia versus Ukraine. I mean, as the people who are writing those tweets you quoted as well, I think would agree with me, at least on this front, where it's not just about Russia and Ukraine right now. It's now about the West versus Russia, and perhaps moving forward, Russia and China. But at this point, the West versus the rest of, liberal democracy, Western Europe and the United States and Canada versus Russia, which makes it a very difficult needle to thread for Israel because we basically have Russia on our northern border, right? They're the biggest, they're the big military actor in Syria. And Israel has this deconfliction mechanism where we call up the Russian army and coordinate with them before we attack Iranian targets in Syria. Russia doesn't like this, but they sort of go along with it.
This is the big thing that I saw, Aaron David Miller not mentioning,
right,
is how did it come to be, first of all, that the Russian Air Force ended up very close to the Israeli border? And the distances we're talking about, if a fighter jet is flying at, twice the speed of sound, how long would it take for a mistake to turn into an absolute disaster? So Israel needs to have very quick and open relations with the Russian military in order to avoid catastrophe, because on the one hand, we are trying to stop the Iranians from entrenching themselves militarily in Syria, and the Russians are, in a way, either indifferent or in favor of propping up the Assad regime with Iran's help. So this is happening right on our border, and we've somehow managed to create this reality, which the former Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think he made up an English word almost, deconfliction. It's
right,
not so used, but this is our situation where one mistake could not just threaten our lives, but lead us into an open confrontation with the biggest country in the world with the most nuclear weapons and so on. So there is this sensitivity in our relationship with Russia that some people, let's say on Twitter, seem to miss.
Yeah, and people who should know better, right? I mean, I don't have a lot of expectations from Daniel Seidemann, but I'm going to get in trouble for this, aren't I? But certainly Aaron David Miller, is a,
former State Department, worked in both administrations,
right,
familiar with Israeli security and diplomacy.
Right, so he should know. Of course, like you were sort of asking this open question, like, how is it that Russia is on our northern border? Well, the reason is, I mean, frankly, you can blame the Obama administration for that, for not keeping to its red lines in Syria. And, nature abhors a vacuum. Russia filled that one up. So whatever, we don't need to renegotiate 2013, 2014 in terms of that. But, at the very least, Aaron David Miller should know that Russia is there and that Israel has to deal with it. And also, like, let's face it, like, okay, let's say Israel donated some guns or whatever to Ukraine. Like, Israel, like you said, we are a small country with a small population. We do have a military that sort of punches above our weight, but it's not because there's so much of it. It's because of our like technological prowess and that we know how to use all these weapons that are very advanced. And so, like, I'm not really sure what exactly he wants Israel to be doing right now. Israel is sending, again, Israel condemned Russia through its foreign minister, and Israel is sending 100 tons of humanitarian aid. So it would be interesting to know what exactly he's expecting and how else is Israel supposed to show that it's a U.S. ally. I know there was some criticism over the weekend that Israel didn't join this UN Security Council resolution to condemn Russia, but Israel's not a member of the Security Council, doesn't actually have voting rights, so it's like virtue signaling. And my understanding is that Israel is going to vote in favor of the UN General Assembly resolution. Probably by the time this podcast comes out, we'll know if it happened or not. But that's the plan at the moment. So, like, I don't know what the expectation is. Now, as far as Daniel Sideman's tweet is concerned, Israelis calling for massive sanctions and propping up the Palestinians militarily, is someone who doesn't like Israel.
It sounds like a misreading of our electorate.
Yeah, definitely sounds like a misreading of our electorate. It's also just, I see people like this who claim to be acting for the good of Israel, and I just wonder, like, what planet they're on that they think that that's the good of Israel. I mean, I find it incredibly appalling. But certainly, yes, when Israelis feel attacked, or even less than that, like Israelis feel unfairly judged by the world, like the response here is generally to like hunker down. It's not to apologize. And I think we could give the Obama administration as an example of that, where I don't feel like the Obama administration mostly attacked Israel, right? But it was more critical than the previous administration had been. And the response was that, Israelis just didn't like Obama, and Netanyahu was very bolstered politically, and he was just more and more bold in his opposition to Obama as the years went on, because Israelis don't like being told what to do. Now, I'm not saying that Israel shouldn't listen to America ever, right? But politically, I think that is a misreading.
One of the other issues that I have seen in the discussion about Israel's calculations for how to approach the conflict in Ukraine is the Jewish communities in both countries. What are you hearing about that, the concerns that we have about the fate or well-being of Jews both in Ukraine and Russia, and are we involved in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Israel is very deeply involved in the Jewish Agency, which is, of course, in large part funded by the government of Israel, or by the Israeli taxpayer, has huge involvement in the former Soviet Union, including Russia and Ukraine. And the Jewish communities in both countries are very large. It depends how you count, right? If halakhically Jewish or by patrilineal descent. But either way, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people in the countries combined. And there's quite a bit of anti-Semitism in both countries, both historically and at present. And I see this coming up. People talk about, like, do you know how many pogroms there were in Ukraine? And I'm like, yeah, okay. But is that really relevant to this war right now? Like, my family escaped pogroms in Ukraine over 100 years ago. Believe me, I know there were pogroms in Ukraine. But right now they have a Jewish president. And right now people live there in relative safety. It doesn't mean that there's no anti-Semitism, but there's anti-Semitism, unfortunately, everywhere. In any case, back to the topic at hand, Israel, is treading very carefully. I think, like, there have been Israeli officials who have called Putin even like philo-Semitic. Like, he has a very good relationship with the Jewish community and the chief rabbi. And there is a worry of Putin being this sort of mercurial figure who could like turn on the Jews if Israel turns on Russia, so to speak. Which it sort of reminds me of these situations that you had in recent history, it was more with Jews in Arab countries in places like Yemen or Morocco, where they like lived in certain towns where they were like under the protection of the king. And then when you had a new king, it was like, oh my goodness, like, are they going to continue protecting the Jews? Yes or no? So like, it feels like this situation where the Jews are living under sort of Putin's protection, and that if Putin turns on them, then they're not going to be safe anymore. That might not be exactly the case, but there's definitely something to it, that when you have an authoritarian leader and that leader is mostly not an anti-Semite, you don't want to make him angry. So there's that. And then there's in Ukraine, where there is quite a bit of anti-Semitism as well, and you want the Jewish community to be safe. Now, at the same time, their president is Jewish, so it's not really state-sponsored anti-Semitism. But these are all things that are being considered. I think that it is not really the prime consideration in what Israel's doing, but Lapid does mention it a lot. So I think that I don't want to say it's an excuse, because I do think it is a consideration, but I do think that it's like an easy thing to pin Israel's like relative quiet on, or it was. Now Israel's being less quiet anyway.
For my audience who perhaps may not know who you are, I'm going to read your Twitter bio.
Okay.
Diplomatic correspondent and senior contributing editor, The Jerusalem Post, podcast host, ex-Knesset reporter, proud Jew and Zionist, wears pink on Wednesdays.
Yes.
This is a movie reference, if
it
I'm
is
not
a movie
mistaken.
reference, yeah.
It's
I'm wearing
not-
pink
it's-
today, too. You can't really see it on camera because it's my pants. But, yeah.
One of the subjects that I thought about as I was thinking about Israel being asked to mediate between Ukraine and Russia is a common message that people said about Israel, especially, let's say, around the years 2009, 2010, and until 2020. And it's the line, Israel is increasingly isolated. And I did a little bit of Twitter research, and I'm just going to quote my own tweet, if I may. This is from August 2020. I wrote, "Where did all the Israel is increasingly isolated people go? Are they okay?" And I attached screenshots from a Google search where I just searched for this term. And I just want to share some of what I found. 2009 New York Times opinion piece, quote, as the Times' Ethan Bronner reported, Israel is increasingly isolated and facing the worst diplomatic crisis in 2 decades. Washington Post, 2011, the story begins, at a time when Israel is increasingly isolated in the world, comma, the American Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, in October 2011, Defense Secretary Leon Panetta warned on Sunday that Israel is becoming increasingly isolated in the Middle East. Again, another story in December. The headline in Reuters, Panetta, Israel must address its growing isolation. BBC, Israel offers talks with Palestinians over UN bid, and the opening sentence is, the Palestinian move at the UN comes as Israel is increasingly isolated in the Middle East. And an AP story from 2014. The headline is, Israel's election, a referendum on Netanyahu. This was back in 2014. And the opening sentence, peace efforts are stuck. Israel is increasingly isolated, and the economy is stagnant. Now, I remember seeing this talking point, Israel is increasingly isolated, and I thought that it seemed like Israel was establishing more and better diplomatic relations with countries around the world than it had and ever before. You can quantify it by the opening of embassies and investment in our economy and so on and so on. So my first question is, it's not my first question, we're well into this podcast. Where did this talking point come from?
So I'll add to that talking point that in Hebrew, the term people like to use is that Israel is facing a diplomatic tsunami.
This was Ehud Barak who warned about this.
Yes, coined the term.
That if we don't do X, we face a diplomatic tsunami.
This was a time in which the Palestinians, we're talking about a decade to 13 years ago. This was a time in which the Palestinians were increasingly taking unilateral steps, looking for recognition as a state by the UN, which it got as an observer state. And from different countries around the world. They wanted an international court of justice investigation into Israel, which it looks like they're going to be getting this year. It was very delayed. And an ICC, an International Criminal investigation of Israel, all kinds of things like that. And at the same time, President Obama was pushing for negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. And there was a whole ceremony at the White House with Abbas and Netanyahu. And I remember I was on the Jerusalem Post internet desk at the time, so I was at my computer watching it on the TV. And it didn't really go anywhere. But Israel actually made what I would say is a pretty fair effort for it not to go anywhere, which is Obama asked for a settlement building freeze. And it was a total freeze. So like if you were, I don't know, if there was a family in Efrat who had twins and they wanted to close off their balcony to make a nursery for them, like that would not be allowed.
It was literally not one brick was the expression that I was seeing.
Right, exactly. Because closing a balcony in Efrat was going to damage Israel, damage the two-state solution. But Netanyahu gave in, and he did that for 10 months. And then at the end of it, they were, Israel was like, okay, are we negotiating now? And the Palestinians were like, no, you have to continue this indefinitely. And Netanyahu was like, maybe you guys show some goodwill now. So that didn't go anywhere. And the Obama administration's excuse was that, well, Israel continued building in Jerusalem. Well, for Israel's not negotiating about Jerusalem. I mean, maximum maybe Abu Dis. But Israel's not negotiating neighborhoods that Jews live in Jerusalem. Like that's non-negotiable for Israel. And certainly the entire Judea and Samaria, there was no building going on there. So it was sort of around that negotiations that didn't really happen. But I've heard from former ambassador Michael Oren years before the Abraham Accords would talk about the subject, and he would say, just like you did, he said, Israel has relations with more countries now than it has ever had before. So how is Israel increasingly isolated? And frankly, I mean, you see it as an Israeli traveling in the world. Like people, for the most part, are not like, oh, I'm from Israel. Oh, I hate you. Like they're like, okay, whatever.
I always saw the message as a bit of a threat.
I think so too.
Like if you don't do this, I am going to isolate you.
Right.
Don't be surprised if, really nice country you have over there, but if you don't do kind of what I want. And, what was the way out of this isolation? As far as, let's say, the Arab world was concerned, there was this thing on the table called the Arab Peace Initiative, which as far as Israel was concerned, demanded more than 100%. It wasn't just a withdrawal to the pre-1967 borders. It was also including the right of return for Palestinian refugees and their descendants.
Which would overwhelm Israel and make it no longer a Jewish majority state.
Even the far left in Israel would have said, okay, we need to at least negotiate this. But it was kind of presented as an ultimatum.
Right.
So we went from this to last year, Israel establishing open, friendly diplomatic relations with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain. This was the Abraham Accords. And I understand that as the Jerusalem Post diplomatic correspondent, you had somewhat of a front row seat to this. So I want to ask you, how do you explain how the Abraham Accords came about, where we started for a decade of, Israel must do this or it's going to be isolated. There is a peace plan on the table, and Israel would always say no. And now major players in the Arab world came around. And I ask this because more of the players involved are going to start writing their memoirs. It's already happened. Sometimes they have maybe contradictory accounts. So I'm curious how you answer the question, how did this happen, the Abraham Accords?
Well, if we're looking at like the preceding decade and we're comparing it, it's interesting because in 2010, preceding 2010, Israel and the UAE and also Bahrain had relations that were like unofficial, cooperation on certain intelligence and security issues. They both saw Iran as a security threat. But then there was the operation in which Israel killed al-Mabrouch, which was like a senior Hamas terrorist in Dubai. And then the UAE completely cut off relations entirely. That was in 2010. And from that point on, Israel really tried to like quietly and subtly rebuild that relationship because they felt that there was a value in that relationship. And after a few years, it started to work. And they really had built the relationship up to what it was before. And then it started to be built even better and to have business elements to it. Then came the Obama administration negotiating with Iran. We are really talking about Obama a lot, by the way, and I was not expecting that, but it's true. In any case, the Obama administration started negotiating the Iran deal, and there were concerns not only by Israel but by the Sunni Gulf states, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and really there are other countries throughout the region which Israel had and now has partnerships with, including Morocco and Egypt, and eventually Sudan as well, that were also concerned about Iran. But at that time, the UAE and Saudi Arabia were really looking at how Israel was so vocal in opposing the Iran deal. Arab negotiation strategies tend to be a little bit more subtle, behind closed doors. They don't say such extreme things, and you have to read between the lines. And you could watch like speeches to the UN by like King Salman of Saudi Arabia, and you can tell that he's angry at Iran, but he's very, very different from the way Israelis
also
speak.
Different from the WikiLeaks transcript. I don't remember if it was him or his predecessor saying "cut off the head of the snake." This was what he had told the Americans, I believe.
Yeah. So, so they were all sort of on the same side in this thing. And the way Netanyahu tells the story is that during his speech to Congress, I don't remember if it was his speech at Congress or his speech at the UN, but during one of his speeches in the US, that representatives of the UAE and of Saudi Arabia were calling his office to say, let's talk, let's work on these things together. So, they sort of came together on these security issues. And Israel has all kinds of technology that it can offer as well, not only for defense things. And those ties began to grow, especially with the UAE. Then, Trump became president. Trump left the Iran deal, which we can get into that. That is a whole other drama. But the Trump administration came up with this peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians, with the Palestinians wanted nothing to do with it. Other Arab countries actually said, okay, this looks like an interesting starting point. Let's put it that way. And there were, I believe, 5 different Arab countries who had relatively positive statements. And among them were the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco, which soon after established relations with Israel. But it was supposed to have 30% of Judea and Samaria become part of Israel eventually, and the rest be the Palestinian state. It was sort of the land on which Israelis also live, plus like a security buffer zone in the Jordan Valley, more or less. And Netanyahu, it didn't really set like a sequencing of
this
the
was
things.
Like January 2020, if I remember.
January 2020. I have to tell you, just like on a personal note, I became diplomatic reporter in December 2020, and it was just like absolutely the craziest first year, between Trump peace plan, then COVID, and then Abraham Accords. But anyway, so my term in this job started basically with the Trump peace plan. And so the sequencing wasn't clear in what was written. And they really wrote out a whole long, I think it was like 80 pages of what the deal's supposed to be. Netanyahu got the impression, it seems from Ambassador David Friedman, that the sequencing could be that Israel would annex or apply sovereignty, I think either terminology is okay, to the land as listed, as shown in the map.
Right. It's like, even though the Palestinians are saying, no, we're going to move ahead with this plan as if it's a blueprint for our future.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Turns out that the White House saw things somewhat differently, and so it became this sort of stuck political situation where the Trump administration said, okay, we're going to start a committee and we're going to draw a more specific and accurate map, because the map that they had in their pamphlet was kind of general. It wasn't like the specific lines of the border, and that they would do it within a few months. But then in Israel, we had a million elections. We had a third election in a year and a half, I believe it was, at that point. And Netanyahu ended up forming a coalition government with Benny Gantz, who was more centrist, who thought that annexation would be a problem. And Netanyahu could have had the votes. He could have just jammed it through. But the Americans were not so happy about doing it when such a major part of the governing coalition is opposed to it. And all of these things delayed it. And basically, the UAE swooped in, is my understanding, saying, we don't really like this annexation thing. We do like Israel these days, maybe we can help. And Jared Kushner saw the opportunity in it. And it was sort of like the UAE and Jared Kushner coming to Israel and saying, why don't you guys normalize relations? You will have made peace and leave this Palestinian thing aside. Now, I think Netanyahu realized that annexation was probably not in the cards at that point. And so he saw this other thing, which is quite good, different from annexation, but a very good thing, and went with it.
It sounded like his excessive promises. He made a pre-election promise to annex portions of the West Bank, yes. And, he's in this new government, if my timeline is correct, with Benny Gantz, and the annexation thing isn't happening, but he's still hinting that he wants to find a way, perhaps. And maybe he didn't mean it. And even if he didn't, he presented it as such that gave the UAE a diplomatic opening to say, we can protect the Palestinians from this annexation. This is a good deal for everyone. Is that sort of what happened?
I do think Netanyahu meant it, at least for the Jordan Valley. I think, if you talk to Dori Gold, who's Israel's former ambassador to the UN, and the director general of the foreign ministry under Netanyahu, very, very close to Netanyahu, he can talk about all kinds of maps that he drew up while working for Netanyahu. And there was just no future that Netanyahu would agree to in which Israel doesn't retain the Jordan Valley. So I do think that was very serious for him. But it could be that, and it seems that Netanyahu didn't quite have the follow through, especially once he no longer had such clear political backing for these moves. So that's like the macro view, I would say, of how we ended up with the Abraham Accords. And I think it's a great thing. I mean, maybe not easy for the Israelis who live in Judea and Samaria, where their lives would be a lot easier in many ways if they were considered part of sovereign Israel, but overall a win for Israel, I think.
And so in 2020 and in the past year, were you traveling to Washington, to the UAE, to Bahrain?
Washington several times and the UAE several times. Somehow, bad luck, I have not been to any of the other Abraham Accords countries. Very unfortunately.
I thought I was the only one. Based on what I see on social media, I've not been invited on any junkets. No one has taken me to a hotel in the UAE. I remember
I've been to the UAE 4 times, which is
the first wave of Israelis who went to the UAE came back with coronavirus. I remember there was a wave of that. People were so excited to get on the plane and go somewhere they could that a decent amount of them brought
that's
COVID
true.
back into
but
the country.
I went with the first Israeli delegation, which was before the Abraham Accords were even signed. The Jerusalem Post had a conference there, and I went with Foreign Minister Lapid and with Prime Minister Bennett. No, Prime Minister Bennett did not invite journalists, so that was the 4th time. Maybe I only went 3 times and I was wrong when I said 4, but 3 times is plenty. And I've seen Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and they're very interesting. So, don't blame I don't blame the 250,000 Israelis who have traveled there, because it's interesting and it's a culture that we, as Israelis don't see as much.
So what is your story, we could call it that? Were you born in Israel, or did you just get here as fast as you could? You're here by choice. How did you get to this position in life where you are a diplomatic correspondent for the Jerusalem Post?
So first of all, I consider myself among the lucky few who sort of had an idea of what I wanted to be when I grew up, when I was 11, 12 years old, and then I'm doing it. Which is, so as far as how did I become diplomatic correspondent for the Jerusalem Post, as a kid, I saw what I felt was unfair treatment of Israel in the media, and I said, I want to be that person and I want to do it right. And I feel like, people can judge if I'm doing it right, but I feel unbelievably lucky and blessed to be in the place that I wanted to be my whole life. But as far as Israel is concerned, I was born in the United States. My mother's Israeli. My father's American. Now he's Israeli. But then he was American. And very Zionist home. We visited Israel every year. My mother, most of her family was here in Israel. I often spent summers here. I spoke Hebrew at home and, watched all kinds of Hebrew children's videos and read all the children's books. Drove my Hebrew teachers in Jewish schools crazy because my Hebrew is better than theirs. And just always really loved Israel. And then as a teenager, I went to B'nai Akiva camps, and I had friends who had either lived in Israel for some time or had more family in Israel, who also had family in Israel, who they started talking about, going to the army, Israeli army after high school, or just making aliyah after high school. And I decided that that's what I want to do. And when it came time to apply to colleges, I said to my parents, I don't want to do any of that. I'm just moving to Israel. They forced me to apply to colleges anyway, but fewer than most of my friends did. So at least there was that. And then I followed through. And the funny thing is that the friends in high school who I think like most I thought was taking it seriously and like I was most in sync with, she never made aliyah. But anyway, I'm here. I came when I was 17. I did a national service Sherut Leumi, which is for religious girls. Now it's been expanded. You have like Haredim and Arabs. But back then it was for religious girls because my parents were worried that if I went to the army, I would come out not religious. So I worked in history museums. I gave tours.
Which ones?
The first year I was in Bet Tfutzot, the Diaspora Museum, which is now called AMI, the Museum of the Jewish People. ANU, right. Yeah. ANU, the Museum of the Jewish People. But back then it was the Diaspora Museum. And then the second year I was in the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, which I did not imagine how helpful that would have ended up being for my my career, because my first real reporting job was to be the Knesset reporter for the Jerusalem Post. But I will get to that. So after 2 years of Sherut Leumi, I went to Bar-Ilan University. I studied political science and communications. And in my last year of college, I started working for the Jerusalem Post at their sort of internet desk, which is like updating the website with breaking news and putting on the articles that other people wrote, putting them online. Today, the job is a lot more involved because you have to know like social media and SEO and all kinds of things. Back then, it was a lot more relaxed. But I learned a lot. I mean, I learned how to turn out a news article very quickly, which was important. I learned what is a good headline. And those are all things that served me well moving forward, because after a year of that, the Knesset reporter went on maternity leave and I was asked to replace her. And then she never came back. And I had that job for 8 years. So that was my first reporting job, and I really enjoyed being in the Knesset. I still miss it sometimes, even though I've been doing this job for 2 years now. Because the Knesset is, I always felt like I had friends in the Knesset, you know, like it was like I had somewhere I was going 2 to 3 days a week, and people I was eating lunch with, and people who I knew I would see all the time. And being diplomatic reporter, I work from home. And then if I have a meeting, I leave the house, you know, so it's like a little bit more isolated, which is less fun in that way. But I do love the travel. It's really interesting. And it's good to expand your horizons. I mean, I'm learning about so many different countries and their politics and their issues and Jewish communities all over the world, even though we have a Jewish world reporter, but I still sort of dip my toes in that area sometimes. And it's really interesting.
So let's talk about the Knesset.
Sure.
I know you speak to a lot of visiting delegations. You're teaching people about the Knesset, about Israeli politics, and we hope there will be many more of these such speaking gigs as tourism returns in high numbers, we hope. And I want to ask you, what is it like meeting people, first timers in Israel, who have no idea what the Knesset is? Are they happier? Are they? Are you jealous of the fact that they have not been having to keep track of this madness? Because if you told me in the start of 2021, if you would have told me, which is not that long ago, 12 months, that a right-wing Israeli politician who positioned himself to the right of Netanyahu for the past decade would gain, let's say, 6 or 7 seats in an election and form a coalition with the left, the far left, and a conservative Arab Muslim party, I would have thought you would have
said, what is a conservative Arab Muslim party?
Yeah, I would have thought you were involved in some silly academic exercise to try to make the math work.
Right.
How do you even begin to explain this reality
there's
that we found
ourselves?
There's
a lot to parse in that statement there, but
that's why we're here.
First of all, unfortunately, I have not spoken to a group like that in a long time, because like there were hardly any birthright groups coming because of COVID. And I used to go to the US and speak on college campuses, and that's been very difficult to do because of the pandemic. I thought I would be doing it in March, but it hasn't panned out. If anyone listening to this wants me on their campus, just hit me up. I'm on Twitter. So it's actually been a long time since I have seen those, you know, sweet summer children who don't know the Knesset, and sometimes adults as well. But
so imagine they're listening right now. How do you tell?
Look, how do you get to it? It takes 45 minutes.
That's what I thought.
But I think that people who don't know Israel well, who are often in these groups, are surprised by how many different political parties there are and how you can have so many parties in one coalition governing, and it's hard for them to wrap their mind around how that works. I also make sure to really emphasize in my talks the role of Israeli Arabs in politics, which frankly in the time since the pandemic started, their role has gotten even greater, and there's going to be even more to talk about. But I think people don't understand like the difference between Palestinians and Arab citizens of Israel, and that Arab citizens of Israel have an equal vote to all other citizens, and that they're, about 10% of the seats in parliament, and now in the coalition. So that's always something that I think I get a lot of questions about, that people are very interested in. And then the other question that people would always ask me is what will happen the day after Netanyahu, like what's next? And I never could have predicted that this would have been it. So, our current coalition is, something you never could have expected. It's almost working, almost. It has a lot of bugs in the system, but all of these parties are trying to work together to keep Israel stable, right? I mean, we had 4 elections in 2 years. We didn't have a state budget. There were all kinds of domestic issues that were sort of going wrong because nobody was paying attention to them. According to Bennett, there was not enough attention even being paid to contingency plans if Iran gets a nuclear weapon or gets too close to getting a nuclear weapon. So, when all the attention is being paid to politics and not to actually running the country, it's a problem. So that's their core goal. Now, in a more cynical terms, and probably more accurate for some parts of the coalition, though not all of them, the priority is not to let Netanyahu be prime minister, right? So, but those things go hand in hand. You can have Meretz, Labor, Yesh Atid, Yisrael Beitenu, who say they will never be in a government with Netanyahu and we need to keep him out of office. While you have someone like Bennett or Benny Gantz, and maybe to a lesser extent Gideon Sa'ar, who say, okay, we need stability. And if there's not going to be a government with Netanyahu, then we need to figure something else out, even if it's not the most convenient for us.
Well, I want to ask you questions about a few of the heads of the political parties.
Yeah.
We can start with Bennett.
Let's go.
What do you make, first of all, of his decision to, I don't know how hard of a decision it was. Maybe you can tell me what you think. I mean, his decision to become prime minister, which involved joining with Labor, Meretz, the left, the far left, with Ram, and is his base still with him? Are the people who voted for him largely okay with his decision, or are they leaving him? What do you think his political future is based on his decision?
Over Bennett's decade in politics, I've had quite a lot of FaceTime with him, and I've always believed that his right-wing positions were genuine, and that's what he really believed. And I actually still believe that he was genuine and continued to be genuine about them. I think that it was not an easy decision for him because of that. I think it would have been a lot easier for him to be in a government with Netanyahu. I mean, the numbers weren't there. There wouldn't have been a government. But in theory, it would have been a lot easier for him to just go with Netanyahu and continue to be basically probably education minister, but maybe he could have negotiated his way into being defense minister again. And then he would have kept his political base, and he could have stayed true to his ideology, and we would have a different political situation right now entirely. I think that in the last couple elections, between the third and fourth election, basically, or after the third election already, he became convinced. And, I think it's a fair argument to make that Netanyahu is really looking out for number one, for his own basically legal and political future, and that Netanyahu will do anything to stay in office. And it's more important to actually have a stable government than for that government to be led by Netanyahu. And so that's how he sort of eventually came to this decision. Now, the reason he insisted on being prime minister and having another senior ministry for his party, which is aliyah in the Interior Ministry, which is maybe not the top 3, but it's number 4 or 5, is that he wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to have policies that are too left-wing. I think he is succeeding in that by basically leaving things as static as possible.
It felt like that if Bennett, for example, got 10 seats rather than the 6 or 7 that he got, the math could have been that with 10 seats he would have been defense minister, but he's only got 6 or 7, so he's prime minister.
But I want to say, when I was talking about Bennett's sort of genuinely felt views on things, I think that being in this government has caused him to sort of rethink certain things. And that he is moderating on certain fronts. He's still opposed to a Palestinian state and to giving up land. But I think he is softening in different ways, in part because I think he was part of this, we could call it a machine, that included Netanyahu, that really, really demonized people on the left. And that now, and you know, like in Beit UD, Bennett's former party, they campaign that Merav Michaeli, who's now the head of labor and in a coalition with Bennett, is calling on people to not serve in the IDF and is anti-Zionist, etc. Now, by the way, Merav Michaeli really did call on people, or women, not to serve on the IDF for feminist reasons. She felt they weren't dealing with sexual assault enough. And this was like a decade ago. So they didn't lie about her, right? But they were using it to demonize the left as not Zionist. And now he looks at these people and he says, truly, we agree on a lot of things. Maybe even, they say most things. It used to be 70% they agree, 30% they disagree. This week I heard an update from someone close to Bennett that it's 80-20. Whatever the number is. I think he's come to realize that they agree on a lot of things, and even in the places that they disagree, say on economics, labor is much farther to the left than Bennett, who's pretty right-wing on Israeli terms on economics, they can still work things out, you know? And so I think that he's changing and his positions are changing. And I don't know if he has a base for those positions. I think, honestly, like, if they want to survive politically, Bennett and Gideon Sa'ar need to combine forces as like this sort of center right-wing bloc.
The next Israeli politician that I want to ask you about is Yair Lapid. Okay. If my memory serves me correctly, which sometimes it does, in 2013, he won something like 19 seats in that election, and he was the next big thing in Israeli politics.
Yeah.
And in subsequent elections, his fortunes decreased, and people dismissed him and said that he was continuing with the, let's say, tradition of centrist Israeli politicians. Maybe there's a bit of hype for a little while, and they crash just as quickly, like the Kadima party and so on. And
like his father.
Like his father.
Shinui party.
He managed to pull off what I think no one expected, even though he hasn't become prime minister yet. He's certainly in a position, and he seems to be the one who put this coalition together in a way. So what do you make of his rise and fall and rise again in Israeli politics, and how he got to this moment?
You know, I think that a lot of the things that made the other parties fall apart was like sort of ugly infighting in those parties, that when you start a new party and you don't really have like an infrastructure the way like Likud and Labor do, or they have chapters all over, and then you have people sort of rising up from those chapters, and you have primaries where people are voted in, you know, the process can be very ugly, because you are bringing in people who you barely know and hoping that they'll have the same values as you and agree with you on things, and it often implodes. Now, Kadima was a little bit different because they were able to build up chapters, and they were people who came from Labor and Likud. But certainly Shinui, that was what happened, and that's what happened with a lot of parties. I think Lapid started his own party out of nothing, but he made sure to consolidate his own power in a really strong way within his party, such that there were no real rebellions. You know, there have been a little things, but overall, he's really consolidated his power. Part of the basis of that power is that he was one of the most famous people in Israel before he entered politics. I think that people outside... He was
a news reporter, or an anchor, rather.
But he wasn't just a news reporter. He was like... Yeah. It was like, by the time he ran for politics, he had been a known name for about 30 years. He had a weekly column in the newspaper. He had written novels. He had starred in a romantic comedy. He had hosted a late night talk show for years. And then in the immediate years before he before he ran for politics, he hosted the most watched newscast in Israel. But I can't see the person who hosts the Friday night Channel 12 news in Israel now being as popular as him, because he was just like this huge celebrity, just a huge celebrity, like one of the most famous people in the country. So that I think that helped him a lot. And he was one of the most famous people in the country, and he was considered, a smart and thoughtful person. He was a good writer. He had ideas. I wouldn't go so far to say that he was considered a public intellectual, right? But he wasn't a dummy for sure. And so he came in with this sort of huge asset. And I think that helped him build the party. And also I do think like he's not corrupt. I can't think off the top of my head of any kind of corruption scandal within his party. And if anything happened and it was small and gotten rid of quickly, but I really can't think of anything right now. He searched for people who were all new to politics, which could go really badly. But he looked for people who were really top of their sort of different areas, whether it was academia or sports or I think he took some people who were in local politics. He did, yeah. But, he took really high caliber, high quality people, leaving aside whether you agree with them politically or not, like successful, intelligent people. And he built something really good, and he persisted. He didn't see going to the opposition as, okay, I lost and now I have to walk away. He said, okay, I am going to be the best, most effective person in the opposition. I think that he's been very smart. I think it's gone very well for him.
And Mansour Abbas is another Israeli politician that has attracted quite a lot of attention for joining the coalition. And as far as most people are concerned, I would assume the Israeli public, most of the Israeli public, and people who follow Israel from overseas, the name Mansour Abbas was not a name that was widely discussed in the past decade. So who is this guy? Who does he represent? Who are his constituents? What are they expecting from him? And what do you make, first of all, of his decision to join the coalition? And how's it going for him?
So Mansour Abbas's roots are in the Islamic movement in Israel. The Islamic movement is sort of like the local branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, but it's split into two branches. The northern branch, which is more extreme, and the southern branch, which is they're still Islamists, but they're more moderate and decide to participate in Israeli electoral politics. For decades. They've been part of the political scene for decades, often running in tandem with other Arab parties. Mansour Abbas comes from that background, but he sort of came to a realization in recent years that the Arab parties focus a little too much on the Palestinians and not enough on the actual day-to-day issues of the people who are voting for them. And he decided that in order to lower the crime rate, in order to get more permits for construction and better infrastructure in predominantly Arab towns and other things like that, he is willing to work with the government. And he basically was a free agent, open to be in any coalition, as long as they gave him the things that he wanted for the Arab public. And that's what he got. He's still a very conservative figure as an Islamist. One of the things that led to his break from the other Arab parties was a vote on outlawing conversion therapy for gay people, which ironically it seems that this government is doing that anyway. But he's against it and voted against it. So, that's just one example. I mean, gay rights in general, he's not very much for it. And he is definitely for maintaining the sort of ties between religion and state in Israel, which helps the most conservative elements, both in Islam and in Judaism here in Israel. But the reason that people are, so amazed and he's become a name that everyone's talking about is that his Ram party is now the first Arab party to be an Israeli governing coalition in decades. And they're the first independent Arab party, because in the past when it happened, it was parties that were like affiliated with labor.
And so in the past, what are the reasons that previous Arab Israeli politicians would not want to join a coalition government? Because for them it would be in a way a tacit endorsement of Zionism, of the Israeli Declaration of Independence,
And
of
the quote-unquote occupation.
Of all of the things that would entail responsibility when you are in the government, what's being done in your name.
Right.
And it seems that Mansour Abbas has, while he's not a card-carrying member of the Jewish Agency or the JNF, has made his peace with the idea that Israel is going to be this one country in the world where the Jewish people are responsible for their own fate. This is a Jewish country in whatever, loose definition of the term you want to give. And he has decided that he wants to, work to better his own constituents in a way that this hasn't been done for 70 plus years. So, I mean, his comments about Israel being a Jewish state and basically just deal with it. Do you think this will continue in the future and Arab parties will be negotiating to be members of future coalitions even in a greater extent, or is this a one-off thing?
So not only did he had admitted that Israel is a Jewish state in an interview and then asked about it, continued to confirm it. He also recently, when Amnesty International put out a report accusing Israel of apartheid, said that no, Israel is not an apartheid state. That's ridiculous. So that's pretty amazing coming from Arab parties in Israel. I mean, the other Arab parties call Israel apartheid every other day, practically. Whether it's a one-off, it's interesting. He has divisions within his own party. There are Knesset members within his own party who are not so comfortable with this situation. And also the Arab parties in Israel, I think all of them really have very sort of strict rules that you can't stay leader for a long time. And so like his days are numbered to some extent. I don't think it's coming up that quick. I don't know the exact dates, but it's like you can't have the same person being leader of a party for like 10 years. Like they don't allow that, with the exception of Ahmed Tibi, who just formed his own party, like so that he could be leader forever. And the number 2 in Ahmed Tibi's party, by the way, is his brother-in-law. So in any case, so it's hard to say. I think there is a chance that Mansour Abbas is a unique figure and that this is a one-off. That being said, he's very popular. So maybe the other politicians will learn from his example. I do think that his approach is a lot more constructive than anyone else's has been in decades in that side of politics.
If you would have come here a week ago, I think we would have spent more time talking about Iran and the nuclear negotiations and that whole situation because, as the previous prime minister used to say when asked what are Israel's priorities, he would say Iran, Iran, Iran.
Yes. And
we are still in a situation where, I don't know if it's an understatement or a euphemism to say that the situation with Iran is not resolved and negotiations are ongoing. Can you provide an update or an explanation of where things stand? And has the Ukraine-Russia war made negotiating about the Iranian nuclear program more difficult, given that Russia is in the room?
Well, I certainly, I thought I might have to interrupt this podcast recording for breaking news because that's just the nature of the job. I did not think that it would be multiple updates about Ukraine, but that's where we are this week. I will start with the Ukraine-Iran talks connection. Up until now, Israeli officials have said that they don't think it's going to make a big difference. Yes, the world is somewhat distracted. But, the U.S. has its special envoy to Iran, and that's who's working on it. And, that it's other than it's a little harder to get people's attention, like it's not going to change anything. At this point, though, with all the sanctions on Russia and, Russia fully invading Ukraine, I think it might be really hard for everyone to be sitting at one table. I mean, and Russia's also sort of Iran's guarantor. Right? They're supposed to be sort of provide the guarantees for Iran to follow the guidelines of whatever agreement is reached. And does anyone trust Russia now? Anyone else at that table? I don't even think China really trusts Russia right now. And they're supposedly on that side. So the talks are on a short break for a few days, and they're supposed to resume this week. And I won't be surprised if they're disrupted in a bigger way.
What does Israel hope or expect from this whole process? Because we went through a period where the JCPOA, the nuclear deal reached by the Obama administration, was a terrible thing. President Trump backed out of the deal. Now we have a new prime minister in Israel, a new president in Washington. What is the goal besides this kind of ambiguous policy statement that, we will not let Iran get nuclear weapons? Like what's the end?
So I'm going to try to make it brief because I could talk about this for an hour.
We'll have you back.
The original JCPOA, the problems in very brief are that, first of all, it only lasts for about 10 years. And the major, that's 10 years starting in 2015. And we're in 2022. Or at least the major restrictions on Iran expire in 2.5 years. After the restrictions are lifted, Iran basically has an international stamp of approval to enrich uranium within limits, but still. I mean, like, why do they need to even enrich their own uranium? If they want nuclear energy, there are plenty of countries that have it without enriching their own uranium. And the sort of safeguards, the monitoring situation was not sufficient. And it goes on. And Iran lied to the world about what its nuclear program was, and Israel warned all along that Iran was lying. And then in 2018, the Mossad smuggled out a nuclear archive that proved that Iran was lying and that they truly had a military plan and that they didn't divulge all of their nuclear sites to the world when they went into this deal. So soon after Trump withdrew from the deal, the plan from people's public statements in the Trump administration was to apply maximum pressure sanctions, which they did, and then use those to get Iran back to the table to negotiate a much tougher deal. Those are from what Trump and Pompeo were saying. And you know how it is with Trump, sometimes you have to try to figure out what exactly he means, but Pompeo's a little bit clearer. However, they didn't get reelected, right? So they couldn't follow through on their plan. Now, Netanyahu has said many times that he doesn't really think that you can negotiate with Iran and that you just have to have crippling sanctions until that changes their behavior. So Netanyahu viewed, I think, Iran's departure from the Iran deal differently from the Trump administration. Now we're in a situation that the Biden administration thinks that the JCPOA was actually a good thing. I mean, it makes sense because they were part of the administration that negotiated it. And that when they came into office, they said they want to return to that deal and then continue negotiations to make it longer and stronger. It's now almost a year later since they started negotiating with Iran, and it seems that we're not even going to get the complete non-proliferation benefits of the JCPOA, as paltry as they were to begin with. We're going to have even less than that. It looks like the agreement that's coming out is not only will it mostly expire in 2025, Iran's going to get a huge influx of cash. The U.S. is going to lift almost all the sanctions that it put on in the Trump administration. Iran's going to get to keep its centrifuges instead of having to destroy them as they did last time. IAEA investigations based on the 2018 Mossad archive, well, it's Iran's archive found by the Mossad. Iran's demanding that those investigations be closed. So it's a real problem. And this government sort of came into office saying we're going to do a whole policy assessment and figure out what we want. And they basically reached the same conclusion as Netanyahu, which is that the JCPOA is bad and going back to the JCPOA is not sufficient to protect Israel from the Iranian nuclear threat. Tactically, they're working a little bit differently, right? Netanyahu really came out guns blazing against the Obama administration, and he went and he spoke before both houses of Congress against the will of Obama at the invitation of the Republicans. And I think I don't think it's the only thing or even the primary thing, but it did damage, I think, the bipartisan relationship between the U.S. and Israel, certainly in Congress. And so Bennett and Lapid said, well, that didn't work. That didn't stop Iran. That didn't make the JCPOA more robust. It didn't convince the Obama administration. So we're going to try to work together with the Biden administration and convince them. Well, that didn't work either. So I don't think it's an issue of who's right and who's wrong at this point so much as the U.S. is going to do what it wants to do. And what it wants to do is to get Iran out of the way and not have to think about it anymore. And that's not good for Israel because they're not going to be tough enough and reach a good enough deal for us.
What do you make of the voices in Israel who are saying or leaking that it would have been better if the U.S. was in the JCPOA than the status quo right now?
I think that, first of all, it's not something that I'm hearing from any of the actually very senior people. for starters. It's all sort of former officials, and like, okay, that's their policy analysis.
We have this thing called the Israeli security establishment. There's this very broad definition in the press.
Right.
It could be former, current. You're not really sure always whose opinion is represented.
So I don't actually think that that's like the representative opinion of what this government thinks. I think that it's not so much about it would have been better if we stayed in the JCPOA. It's more that there was not good planning of what to do after you left the JCPOA, which is different, right? I think that Netanyahu, Bennett, Lapid, and Gantz could have been on board with a well planned out day after the JCPOA, and we didn't have that. And as I said a few minutes ago, I think that Netanyahu and the Trump administration saw the post-JCPOA plan differently. And the Biden administration actually suspects, they haven't said this on the record, but I've heard this from some officials, that they suspect that Netanyahu and John Bolton wanted regime change in Iran. And that was their goal in these sanctions. I don't think, I mean, just from the things that Trump actually said out loud, and Pompeo as well, I don't think that's what they were thinking, regime change. I think that they were thinking that they would negotiate a better deal. So
how does this all end? Is there a red line? Is there a indefinite process?
Look, I mean, Israel says that they're not going to let Iran get close to nuclear breakout. Nuclear breakout doesn't even mean you have a weapon yet, right? But and the U.S. says that they'll never let Iran get a nuclear weapon. The problem is that it's going to be really hard to destroy Iran's nuclear program militarily. For physical and technical reasons, they have a lot of it buried underground. They have it in multiple sites. So it's a little bit different from, say, Syria or Iraq, where we just bomb their reactors. And the other thing is that in Iraq, their nuclear reactor was built with help from French scientists, and in Syria it was built with help from North Korean scientists. In Iran, they did it themselves. They still have that knowledge, and they could do it again. You can't destroy that. I mean, I guess you could assassinate every single nuclear scientist in Iran, but I just so I don't really have an answer of how we solve this problem. It's a tough one, and it's scary, and frankly, the more I learn about it, the less reassured I am.
On a lighter note, you recently tweeted your New Year's resolution, which was to read more books.
Yes.
Can you share any interesting books that you have read recently, or any books that you would recommend to an audience who's interested in Israel, the Middle East, politics, and so on?
Okay, so one of the things that I started last year is I started keeping a Google Doc, like a list of all of the books that I read. And it kind of helps me just remember them better, because then I'm not like, wait, when did I read this?
You're reading on all subjects. I shouldn't restrict it to...
Yes, so I read about anything. But I did finish, it took me almost 2 years on and off, but I did finish the biography of Winston Churchill by Andrew Roberts. I highly recommend it. And if you're able to read an 1,000-page book without taking many breaks over the course of 2 years, that's probably an even better way to read it than the way I did. But I still recommend it. As far as an Israel book, of course, this is what I've read in the last 6 weeks. I'm looking at my 2022 list, but there's a book that's going to come out in March called Who by Fire by Mati Friedman, and it's about Leonard Cohen. I mean, maybe people have seen those famous pictures of Leonard Cohen playing for Israeli soldiers in the Yom Kippur War, and it was sort of about like how he got there and how that experience inspired his music, and I really enjoyed it. And I really like Mati Friedman's writing in general.
I agree.
Yeah, he recently wrote the book Spies of No Country, I guess a couple years ago, which is about Jews from Arab countries who were spies for Israel in the War of Independence in Lebanon. Fascinating book. And I think it also tells you a lot about sort of Israeli culture and Mizrahi Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. So I recommend that as well. And if we're talking about fun books, there's this novel, A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles, which everyone who's read it likes it. Like, I don't think I've ever encountered someone who didn't like it. And I read it a while ago, probably a couple of years ago, but this year I read the 2 other books he's written. One of them I didn't like as much, so I will recommend the one that I did like, which is called The Rules of Civility. Very fun novel.
When you're not reading books, I know you spend a lot of time on Twitter because I'm constantly there as well, refreshing, seeing your tweets.
Too much time.
How would you say that social media has either helped or hurt both your work as a journalist and your effort to promote your work? Does it drive you in a direction where you feel like you have to do things that people will like on social media and maybe spend less time on boring stuff? How does it affect your whole work?
I think it's really helped me promote myself as a speaker, and also even just as a journalist, as someone who people want to talk to, because I have a voice that's really out there online. And I don't know how many people like read an article and look at the byline, but when you see me on Twitter, like,
I don't know
you
how
see
many
it's
people
me.
read an article.
Well,
Period. This is
right.
another issue you deal with, where
True.
you will report something and it's in the article and it's your report and people will be criticizing you, and you literally have the answer in the report.
That drives me a little bit crazy.
It's
but
good for engagement maybe on Twitter.
But it's a known thing in journalism that like you need to put the most important information at the beginning because people don't finish an article. So I do try to do that. But it has helped me to be out there in the sense that like people come to me with stories. And that's really helpful. And it's also helped me on my sort of side gig, which is people come to me to lecture. So that's helpful as well. It helps me get a lot of information, especially now that I'm diplomatic reporter and I need to follow news from all over the world, and I can't read every single news site in the world, so it is helpful that I see tweets from all over the world. I'm trying very hard not to get bogged down in all the arguments on Twitter and to not comment on every stupid anti-Israel tweet, and I think I'm getting better at it. After a while, it just got too exhausting. But it is sometimes very distractive and a time suck.
One of the reasons I wanted to try the podcast thing is to maybe spend a little less time on social media and worrying about the arguments of the day and trying to, one, build my own audience, and also to bring on people whose tweets I follow and let them express themselves in a bit longer than 280 characters. So if people would like to either find you on Twitter, follow you, invite you as a speaker, how do they do that?
So on Twitter, I am at Lahav Harkov.
Spell it.
LAHAV HARKOV. No dots or underscores or anything like that. And you can tweet at me. That's the easiest. And I am available for speaking in Israel and abroad. I also host the Jerusalem Post podcast. It's a weekly podcast, so we talk about the news and we interview interesting people. So I recommend that you subscribe. We're on all the big platforms, Spotify, Apple, etc. And of course, you can find me every day on jpost.com, where my articles, 99% of my articles go up.
Well, I want to thank you very much for coming on my podcast, which is so new that at the time of this recording, I do not even have an episode live. You are my second guest. We're sitting at a ping pong table still, very much an amateur setup, but this is part of the process. So thanks for coming and being a guest, and I hope to have you back.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks again.